Joining us now to talk about the death of Sarah Everard, a story that has made massive news in the UK, less so here in the US. And so it's important that we learn about this from someone who understands the story. We're very lucky to be joined once again by columnist for The Intercept, as well as author of Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, Natasha Lennard. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Very glad to have you here. So this death has sparked a lot of conversation. You had a really amazing breakdown of a number of different ways that different aspects of politics and society and the way we comment on specific comments based on the context of who's in the story all combined. Can you tell me a little bit about your interest in this particular murder?
Right, so Sarah Everard is a British woman, a 33-year-old woman who was kidnapped and murdered in London. And her remains were discovered. And so it was a kind of almost archetypal horror of a gender-based violence. And it sparked a massive response in the UK and a very necessary conversation about what was broadly described as women's safety. But a lot of the response and the shape of the response played on a lot of archetypes around what we talk about when we talk about danger that I think are pretty outdated and need to be, we need to have a critical response about. So it was a lot of talking about women in public spaces, stranger danger, the kind of horror stories that you're told about as a child, about not going home alone after dark. And of course, people have very valid fears of the kind of risk a woman alone at night can face that seem to be realized in Sarah Everard's murder. But what was missing from that dialogue was the particular shape of how she was killed. The person who has been charged with her murder is a member of the London Metropolitan Police force. So this was also a story about who gets accorded trust and indeed gendered state violence, police violence, and also obviously the broader conversation about which murders garner attention. That's not to say something as horrific as what happened to Sarah Everard shouldn't produce rage and attention. But of course, when counterparts, women who are not white women, black women, other women of color, black trans women are assaulted in public spaces. And that is indeed a structural problem that happens consistently within that demographic. It doesn't create the sort of outpouring we saw. So what I was trying to point out is that, yes, this is an unthinkable horror, but we have to think about the structures that enable and perpetuate gendered violence on a mass scale. And those include police violence. And so, the answer of how do we criminalize dangers to women? How do we increase policing of it? That are often the responses to these kind of horrors, totally miss the point that that kind of policing and the way the state can enhance dangers to women's bodies, particularly some women's bodies, must not be overlooked and is absolutely not a solution.
Yeah, I understand the need to provide the caveat that, pointing out that this sort of story does get talked about shouldn't be seen, but might accidentally be seen as disregarding that it is its own tragedy, its own horror, which is totally true. But you're 100% right that certain sort of stories just naturally produce not just recognition, but possibly a week of coverage, and other sorts of stories not so much, or they require some sort of special circumstance. Like the media might focus on violence against Asian American women if enough of them die in a very limited period of time, then it might merit coverage. But I also wanted to focus on the aspect of, you talked about it led to this conversation about what is dangerous and all that, and it seems like it took quite a bit of work for the fact that the person who did this, that might be a cop, to count as dangerous. That you almost weren't supposed to point out that, well, yeah, obviously we know that. You list great statistics in the story about the predisposition that you seem to see with domestic violence when a cop is involved in this. So and it looks like in this particular case, what happened at a vigil, which perhaps you can describe for us, that might have made that part of the story a little bit more front and center.
Right. So there was this kind of interesting shift that happened that, I think was a very necessary shift, in that immediately after Sarah Everard's body was discovered, the popular conversation seemed to be about this woman walks alone at home at night, stranger danger, really kind of footnoting the relevance of the police in this story. But then at a mass vigil that was held for Everard in London, the Metropolitan Police, the very police force that the accused murderer is part of, broke up the vigil because it had not been sanctioned. But they broke it up in an incredibly violent way. So there was this imagery of, officers manhandling, throwing women to the ground in the name of public safety. And these were women, a kind of a vigil organized by an organization called Sisters Uncut, talking about women's safety, public safety, the inclusion of trans women's safety. And then it was police officers manhandling them in the name of safety. So it was really on the nose. Mm-hmm. And that very crucially did in fact bring the conversation of state violence, police violence against women into the conversation. And what's been interesting is that following that vigil and the police violence in it, we've seen the activism and the anger around Sarah Everard's murder also translate and encompass an anger about police violence and a kind of connection with the women's safety movement that is responding to the murder, to activism and organizing that was already going on against a new bill that has been proposed for England and Wales that would give police really dangerously expanded capacities to break up protests. So watching those two efforts combine, I think has been really heartening and really important, and a really worthwhile shift away from talking about individualized safety of individual women against strangers, as opposed to state violence, and of course the far more common violence of the home and domestic violence.
Exactly. So that bill, what led to that being a thing that in theory could pass? And do you think that it is likely that this recent conversation, the shift in the conversation and how it applies to that bill might be successful in stopping it?
So the bill is actually a really capacious bill. It's not just about protest policing, but it's about resources for police in general, and it's about capabilities of police, but a very particularly dangerous, threatening to civil liberties aspect of it that had drawn attention even prior to the Sarah Everard vigil. I see as a response to the kind of protests you saw in London as well as here in the US, protests against policing, against racism, Black Lives Matter protests, anti-colonial protests that you saw really take off in England, and this expansion of police powers, I see as non-coincidentally a follow-up to that. So the struggle against racial violence in policing is certainly connected to this. So this bill was somewhat long in the making in this last year, but anger against that sort of police intervention against protesters and their rights has really been brought to the fore after that vigil. And in terms of this, it's called hashtag kill the bill, kill this policing bill. That's the kind of rallying cry that the intention seemed to be to rush the bill through Parliament very quickly. And it looks like the organizing and people in the streets in response to that have genuinely made a difference, and it's been slowed down and will be considered more slowly and challenged, I think, with a far greater degree. So I think you see the power of people really responding to this and refusing to accept this narrative that more policing equals safety, which has obviously been so much of the crucial political conversation here on the left.
Yeah. And one last thing I wanted to ask you about. You referenced, as I alluded to earlier, some stats about I believe it was here in the US how you see something like 4 times the rate of domestic violence in households with police officers. You referenced a petition about all hundreds of instances of abuse that had effectively led to no consequences whatsoever. Do you see any indication, whether in the UK or possibly to the extent that this story is being covered in the US, that anything might come out of this socially of recognition that this is a pervasive problem, that whether it ends up that this is what happened with that one case or not, that this link is clear, well established across multiple countries?
Yes, so I mean, the statistics you're talking about, there have been 2 studies in the US that are somewhat contested, but this was 2 separate studies that say that, yeah, rates of domestic violence in policing families is up to 4 times as high. In the UK in 2019, there was a super complaint brought against over a dozen police forces, referencing over 700 alleged instances of domestic abuse that led to scant consequences for the officers involved. So, these are structural problems, and it's a very English tendency that I've seen to say, oh, the police are a problem over there across the Atlantic. That's where the racist policing exists. But clearly, as the protests of last summer showed, as the London uprisings in 2011 made clear, this is a problem in both nations where policing exists as such. Is there going to be a reckoning? I think the uprisings of 2020 show the need for that reckoning and are the burgeoning of that long overdue and long fought for reckoning. Do I think the response to the policing of Sarah Everard's vigil and the activism in the UK right now will be, the end of it and the necessary turning point? No, this is a really hard fought, almost Sisyphean task, but it's, I think, really impressive the amount of ferocity and potency that we're seeing in the actions against policing as an institution.
Agreed. So there's a lot of different elements that we're talking about here that we've touched on. But if anyone watching this would like a lot more detail, Natasha's article is up at The Intercept. Search for women's safety movement sparked by Sarah Everard's murder should focus more on cops in the home. You can get way more detail there. And Natasha, we want to thank you both for your work on The Intercept and also for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.